Tristan Kumar's The Final Enigma. Volume 2, The Travelers and the Outcasts. Narrated and written by Tristan Kumar. Act 7, The Severe Conflict. Part 31, The Negotiation. Their dirty boots walked through our streets, the ones who didn't belong. They scowled at others, only coming for what was theirs and not bothering to care for anybody else. Reckless, uncontrollable, and not in the mood for patience, but ready for war at any time. I watched nervously as the outcasts went deeper and deeper into the city following Eric. I looked at Xavier, Samantha, and Deshawn. We all weren't sure how he was going to handle the situation. I pulled up my fingerless gloves and continued to walk with the others down the side of the street as a patrol for the visitors. Eventually, they reached the unfinished travelers' joints, which were still under construction from last night. Eric waited at the door as they walked inside. I tried to follow them, but Eric held up his hand to stop me. "Not this time, Harley," he said. "I hate to admit it, but you're going to need some help in there, and you know that," I said, as he closed his eyes. "Well, I don't know what to say. If I say the right thing, then we'll lose two of our most important members. But if I say the wrong thing, then we'll wage war on them. I don't want that to happen," Eric said as the outcast grabbed mugs from inside and started filling them with beer. "Well, I better go," he said as he began to walk inside. "Wait," I said before he closed the door. "Yeah?" he asked. "Just speak from your heart," I said. He looked up into the sky, thought about it, and smiled as he nodded and closed the door. The door finally closed and latched shut as I sighed. There was a slim chance that he would make it out of the joint alive. I walked to the side window and looked inside. I decided that even if I couldn't be there to express myself, I might as well watch what he would do. I peeked through the dusty window and saw all of the outcasts spread around the joint. Eric was still at the door, probably thinking about what I had said, and finally walked towards Sam, who was at the bar, laughing with the other outcasts, selfishly thinking they would get exactly what they wanted right then and there. Through the window, I could still see Eric pissed at Xavier, and he had the right to be pissed. I was going to join him in being mad at Xavier, but I was shocked to find out that he was actually trying to defend him and making him not willing to leave to make things right. Eric was a good leader. He couldn't see that himself, but he was. But Xavier had made a very big mistake of not telling us about these guys. Ever since we sat together at that counter in a diner in Akron, I knew that something was off about him. He told me where he was from, but he had lied when I asked him if anything was wrong when he was on the phone. He was probably talking to the outcasts and realized that they were actually coming, and he didn't bother to tell us, which was a bad decision on his part. Was he scared? Was he trying to protect us? Or was he intentionally hiding it from us? Well, the past is the past, and I couldn't change it any more than the decisions that were made in this joint between the travelers and the outcasts. Eric had finally reached the counter and grabbed a full mug which Sam had friendly slid him. "Thanks," Eric said, and Sam nodded and turned to him. "Now, Xavier and Patient One," he said, demanding them right off the bat. "It's not going to be that simple," Eric said, trying to make something up before they launched into their controversial conversation. "Explain," Sam said menacingly. He was a man without mercy. He had a plan, and he wasn't going to change it just because some puny leader who had what he wanted was going to stop him. "Well," Eric started, but realized that they should probably talk someplace more private. "How about you follow me so we can talk privately?" "All right, sure, lead the way," Sam said, as they both set down their beers and went outside. I quickly scampered away from the window and backed away from the joint and hid behind a small supply crate. I watched from behind the crate as they walked out of the joint and started heading toward the back of the joint where I was. I held my breath as Eric led Sam to the large gravel area behind. They turned to each other and started to talk, but this time I couldn't hear them due to the large gust of wind blowing the gravel, so I stood upright and walked behind the other crates to get closer. I peeked around in other crates and listened to their conversation. "And he's my guy. You can't just take one of our own," Sam said angrily. Eric, clearly looking intimidated but staying strong, looked him in the eyes and fought for the protection of Xavier. "He is happier here. You can't tell him to do something just because he was part of your community before. Let him decide. I guarantee he'll want to stay here, not in your small, weak domain up in Canada," Eric yelled. It probably wasn't the best idea to yell at a man who looked like he could kill you at any moment, but I told him to speak his heart, and I guess his heart was pretty pissed. Before I continue, there's a small piece of advice I have for people who plan to have an important conversation determining the fate of many people. So, here it is. Do not start a physical conflict with your negotiator. I'm saying this because Sam clearly was fed up, but still made the worst decision by clenching his fists. I could see it from a mile away, just as Sam quickly raised his fist and punched Eric in the face. He fell to the ground as dust rose all around him. Your puny little society is much worse than mine, and not to mention, right under the frickin' prison of the survivors, Sam yelled as Eric got up on his hands and knees, trying to get up. A guest in our city like Sam couldn't just punch down our leader and not get what's coming for him. I clenched my fist and began to run and attack Sam, but I felt a hand on my shoulder. My heart leapt a mile as I turned around, beginning to hyperventilate. Was it one of the outcasts? I calmed myself when I saw that it was just Patient One. Jeez, man, I said as I took some deep breaths, calming myself and not trying to alert Eric and especially the enraged Sam. Sam continued yelling and barking at Eric, who had gotten back up weakly as Patient One and I watched from behind the crate, knowing it was too risky to do anything right now. Finally, Sam stopped and they both looked at each other, Eric seeing dark hatred in Sam's eyes. Eric spat out blood and finally made an agreement. We'll deal with this later. He walked away from the furious Sam as dust blew around him. He scowled and walked away from him and back toward the traveler's joint. Now, Patient One said, letting me run after Eric. We both immediately got up and jogged after Eric. Sam turned around to see what he had heard, but barely missed us. We found Eric walking past the entrance and down the street away from the traveler's joints, not knowing what to do anymore. We jogged down to the dusty street past everyone else who had no idea what was going to happen. Finally, we reached Eric sitting on a bench in the gravel looking at Cheyenne Mountain. We stopped running and slowly walked up to him. Don't let him know that we heard, Patient One whispered to me. I nodded, knowing that his idea was very smart. We didn't want Eric to be even more superstitious. I walked forward with Patient One shortly behind me to Eric. I sat down beside him on the bench, but he didn't look at me. He wasn't crying. He wasn't mad. He was just sitting there, with no emotions whatsoever. He looked at the mountains, and I joined in by looking at them as well. The large, majestic clouds soared above them as we sat in silence, which was broken by the wind and people walking on the loose gravel street behind us. What happened? I asked, pretending like I knew nothing. I don't know, he said. Tell me, I said. I don't really know how to say this, but I may have just started another war, he said morbidly. Hey, don't think so terribly of yourself. You tried your best, I said comfortably, as I saw the red mark on his face where he was punched. You weren't there, he said, and I thought that it was better not to say anything more on that topic because I knew that I couldn't get away with a lie, and I didn't want him to know that I was there either. So, what are we going to do? I asked. There was a long silence between us, but Eric finally made up his mind. We're leaving, he said as he stood up, thinking he had formed a sudden great idea. Wait, what? I asked immediately, standing up as well. We can go into the mountains. North Cheyenne Canyon will do, Eric said, giving up all hope of staying here and thinking a great idea had dawned on him. Wait, what's going on? I yelled in confusion as Eric began to walk away from the bench. We can't stay here without waging war, so we have to protect Patient One and Xavier by going into the mountains and hiding out until they give up, right? Besides, no one wants to start a war at our only base of operations after all, right? Eric said. I was about to ask another question, but I realized that his idea to migrate into the mountains was probably the best chance we had at survival for now. We went throughout the town and started to tell people the plan. They quickly left after we finished to prepare for leave for that night. I nodded, confident in our migration, but I saw Sam at the doorway of the traveler's joint, watching our every move and ready to strike like a deadly viper. Part 32. The Violent Brawl. I adjusted the strap of my bag on my shoulder as I gripped my large gun even tighter. Xavier and all the other travelers were behind me. Eric finally came to us behind the crates and saw us all. We were ready. It was pitch black, but we were by the road and ready to journey into the midst of the magnificent peaks. Eric held a large gun and loaded it loudly as he looked around the corner of the crate again. He nodded at me, and I nodded back. Immediately, I stood up and ran toward the street. I began to jog down the gravel road to the entrance of North Cheyenne Canyon. All of the travelers followed behind me as I ran down and led the way. Quickly, I stepped aside and let the other unarmed travelers run ahead. Xavier, Patient One, Samantha, and Deshawn all stepped to the side with me, with large guns as well. All of the remaining travelers ran on the loose road into the night as we five began to jog back to Eric. He let the rest of the travelers run down, and he nodded at us. We began to run, but we suddenly heard gunshots from the travelers' joints. All of the outcasts ran out and fired their many guns at us. We all loaded our guns and began to fire as we slowly stepped backward, trying to get far, far away from them. "Now!" Eric yelled, and we all let go of our guns as they hung from our necks and sat behind our backs. We ran like hell down the street as the bright muzzle flashes from the many guns lit up the city and echoed loudly throughout the buildings. They all got closer and closer to where we all were before we bolted for the streets, but we were already long gone. I heard Sam shout, although we couldn't hear what he was saying. In truth, we all thought that he was letting us know that we were now in a war with them. I thought that it was over, but he suddenly threw something at us. Surprisingly, he threw it over us, and although we seemed very far away, we all kept running. Suddenly, a large explosion from the grenade that he had thrown, which we had not expected, rocked the ground below us, and we all yelled as we were propelled back onto the ground. From the ground, I could see 5 people, including Sam, running toward us with murderous intent. As I got closer and closer, I could notice that they all had handheld knives. I aimed my gun at them, but I was unluckily out of ammunition. So was the rest of us. I lifted it over my head and threw it to the ground. There were no clouds above us, and the moon shone brightly above us in the starlit navy-colored sky. The rest of the outcasts ran back into the city to grab more materials, ready to follow us and fight us. I heard something from beside me and turned to see that everyone had their knives out. I nodded in confidence as I took my knife out from the sheath on my waist. I looked at the moon's reflection in its shiny blade and took some deep breaths. Finally, they all reached us. Everyone started to fight, but I stood without competition in front of me. Suddenly, I heard the turn of a foot in the loose gravel beside me and heavy breathing. The sudden gust of wind also gave it away. I ducked without any time to see what was happening and narrowly dodged Sam's knife, which was swinging right toward my head. I jabbed my knife at his knees, but he moved out of the way, and I stood back up. We began to look at each other, waiting for the others to strike as the many grunts and clashes of knives surrounded us. "I'm surprised Eric didn't see you there," Sam said, which no one seemed to hear. I continued to think about how I would strike, but he continued. "At the Traveler's Joint, it was so damn obvious that you were spying on us. But it seems that all the travelers want to be secretive, and," he said, as I clenched my fist around my knife and adjusted my stance, ready to strike at last. "Oddly very defensive. Let's see how that holds up, shall we?" He smiled as I lunged forward at him with my knife. He dropped to the ground and held himself up with one hand as I retracted my arm once more. He jumped back up and switched his knife to face back toward him. He swung his knife around my head, but I bent back and watched it fly by me. Suddenly, he flipped it in his hand and began to bring it back. Luckily, I put my blade in front of me, and they both clashed. In my peripheral vision, I saw that 3 people had defeated their enemies on my side and began to help the other 2, but not me. Sam pushed his blade toward me harder, but I held my ground. Eventually, I pushed back and his knife flew out of his hand. The other 2 beside me finished fighting, and they all turned to me. Sam tripped backwards and fell to the ground. Eric, Deshaun, Samantha, Patient One, and Xavier joined behind me as we all prepared to strike again. He looked beside him to see his other dead members. "You think I'm scared? You've just waged war when you're already in one," Sam yelled at us. "How does he know?" Eric started, but Sam continued menacingly. "Yeah, you don't think we've heard about it? Someone in your ranks is telling some lies to you guys and providing us with some information," Sam yelled. We all looked at each other, trying to figure out who was smuggling information to the other side, but we couldn't figure it out at that moment because we looked back toward the city and saw all of the other outcasts running with larger weapons than ours running toward us. Sam stayed on the ground as we quickly grabbed our guns and began to run to the others. Everyone else ran to the others who were far down the street now, but I saw Eric stay for a moment. I stopped and listened while I waited for him. "It doesn't have to be this way," Eric said, still trying to resolve our conflict. Sam just stared at Eric, ready to kill him at any moment. They both looked at each other, but I broke the moment to get going. "Eric!" I yelled, and he came back to his senses, knowing that he had done enough and that Sam had asked for what was coming to him. He turned to me, and we began to run down the road far behind the others. The other outcasts finally reached Sam and started to fire at us, illuminating the dark road with bright flashes like before. They missed, and we continued to run. Eventually, Sam said something and they stopped, which probably meant that they were going to get us one way or the other, but not right then. Eric and I eventually caught up to the others, and we all ran together to the other waiting travelers around the corner of the road. We finally reached them and stopped. We all caught our breaths while they looked at us. We were like their leaders. We all smiled as we walked toward the entrance of North Cheyenne Canyon and into the wild. "I don't want to say it," Jamal said behind me as I stared outside. It was still dark, and I watched as more gun flashes shone up at us from the ground below. We were in the lower atmosphere, but with an enhanced view, we could see almost everything below. Finally, the gun flashes stopped as the 2 people ran down the road. There was only one group I thought that there was only one group we had to worry about, I said angrily as I turned around to Jamal and Sylvie, who were lounging around in large leather chairs in our private conference room. I didn't know about any other survivors, Sylvie said as she stood up and walked to me. This is terrible! I saw them almost kill the corpse crawler last night, and now they have help, I yelled as she came up to me and crossed her arms, all of us not knowing what to do. I'm not sure they like each other, Jamal said as he stood up and walked around. I heard his comment and began to think that he was right. We just need to let it play out, Sylvie said to me softly. I looked into her sparkling eyes and sighed. I put my hand on my head in frustration, but she touched my cheek. My heart jumped up as her soft hand soothed my hand into dropping off and away from my face. I looked at her, and she looked back at me. We were so close for the first time in a long time. What do you say, Roy? Jamal said, breaking the moment. Sylvie smiled as her hand left my face. She walked away from me and moved toward Jamal. I took a moment to evaluate the situation on what had just happened, but focused once more. I took a moment to evaluate what had just happened with her, but focused once more on the situation and walked toward the window where we could see the small people walk back into the town. I put my hand up and swiped it through the air to focus on the others who were running. There was a small group of people near the forest's edge before it ascended into the mountain. I knew that Eric was down there, but without Agent 39, they were useless against my power. Trying to fight the corpse crawler again would surely get them all killed. I sighed as I turned away from the window. I walked to a blank space in my wall, and it suddenly turned itself and revealed a large black suit in a glass enclosure. On the chest was a small black cylinder. The glass descended into the ground below, and I placed my hand on the cylinder, feeling the power and seeing all the possibilities that could happen. Finally, I made up my mind. Both of you, control this place, I said, as the suit suddenly began to shrink into a small disc. It finally stopped, and I took it off the wall and held it in my hand. I'm going down there. Part 33. Hiding in the Peaks. My feet burned as I continued through the road, which was lit by sunlight by small gaps through the large trees above us. There was a lot of dust on the road, and hiking with a large bandana over my mouth made it 10 times as difficult. Sweat ran down my forehead as the sun beat down on us all. In front of me was Patient 1, who was behind Eric. Behind me was Xavier, Deshawn, and Samantha. Behind them were all the rest of the travelers, what few of us there were. We were still walking up the long road to the top of the canyon, but we were all so tired. It was still morning, but the sun was beating down on us very heavily. We walked together in the middle of the dusty road. There weren't many of us left after 2 nights ago with the treacherous attack of the corpse crawler. Everything was happening so fast. My feet ached as we turned around the corner around the rock face. Finally, we reached the midway point. The road went up a bit further and led to a small but beautiful waterfall that came off from a ledge. There was a small bridge that was covered in vines that were held above it. In front of the falls was what used to be a visitor center. We finally reached it after walking across the decently flat and partially sandy parking lot. We set our bags down and began to look around. Above the entrance to the building was a damaged sign that read, Helen Hunt Falls Visitor Center. We decided that we would rest there for a bit before continuing. We were definitely sure that the Outcasts were following us, but we didn't know when they would catch up to us. Xavier and I both went to the bridge. Once we got there, we both leaned against the railing together, watching the water flow beneath us. After all that had happened since the storm created the chaos, regular things in nature still stood, unaffected and even more beautiful than before. It was like seeing the world before civilization came along and ruined it. I smiled, for it was very peaceful there. I turned to Xavier. He wasn't smiling. He was upset. "What's wrong?" I asked, and he turned to me. "I just feel that this is all my fault," Xavier said, putting all the blame on himself. "It isn't your fault. It's the Outcasts' fault," I encouraged him. No, I was the one who decided not to tell Eric or the other travelers about the Outcasts," Xavier said, feeling down about himself. I had only met him around a month ago, but I still had to comfort him and not make him seem like the enemy here. "You can't just say that. You're helping us all. You are one of the most important members of the travelers," I comforted. He sighed and hung his head. "You know, I got a phone call a bit after we got here," he said, as he picked up his head once more. "Who was it from?" I asked, although I had suspicions of who. Luckily, I was correct. "I got a phone call from Sam. He told me that he felt like I had betrayed him and that he was going to come here with the others and take what was rightfully theirs. I hung up the phone and you asked what was wrong. I felt guilty of supposedly betraying Sam and that I had continued to protect you, so I lied. I told no one, and when I saw them coming, I knew that I was going to pay. It was a blessing that Eric didn't immediately hand me over, but when the time comes, he's gonna have to, I'll bet, Xavier explained. You didn't have to do that to protect me, I said as I slowly placed my hand over his on the railing. He looked at me. In his eyes, I could tell that he felt that there was no longer hope for him anymore. I already trusted you, I said, and he smiled. But now, I have no idea how we're gonna get out of where we are. I've been with the Outcasts, and I know there's no way to stop what's coming from them. They're tactical, they're stealthy, and they'll kill us all with no hostages if they feel like it, Xavier explained morbidly. Well, we have two options. Either we could walk down this hill hand in hand and go out together, or we could run from them, run from what they want. Who cares what the Outcasts want? If you want to go and join them, I'm coming with you. But if you want to stay with us, then we will figure something out that gives the benefit of the doubt to all of us. How does that sound? I proposed. He smiled. I guess I'll stay here for a while, he said. He slowly got closer to me, and I got closer to him. For the first time in a month, I could truly see through all the courage on the outside of him and see the soft, caring inner self. Finally, we both dropped our masks and kissed. It was short, but it was the sweetest thing I had ever done. We finally separated and opened our eyes as we put back on our masks. The world seemed to glow around us as we smiled. We both wanted this, and we had gotten what we wanted with no repercussions. The air around us seemed to be immersed in the wonderful feeling of love. I wish I could have stared into his eyes forever, but like all relationships in this story, things tend to end quickly. Maybe there would be a good ending, maybe a sad one, or even a bad one, but at that moment, I didn't care what happened to us. I was just happy to be with him. Suddenly, the moment shattered as we heard yelling from below us and down to the other travelers. From the trees around us came many people with black masks. They all had guns and began to fire at us. Xavier grabbed my hand, and we both ran off the bridge. I couldn't get the chance to look again, but the bridge exploded and fell into the large pool of water below the waterfall. We ran across the scraggly rocks and reunited with Samantha, Deshawn, Eric, and Patient One. We all parted our guns and started to fire at them. They seemed to come from everywhere. Suddenly, I heard Eric groan from behind me. I turned and saw a tranquilizer dart in his chest. They're not trying to kill us, he realized weakly. He suddenly fell to the ground. I went to check on him to see if he was okay, but Patient One suddenly hit by a dart as well and fell to the ground. Harley, run! Xavier yelled to me as both him and Samantha fell to the ground as well. Deshawn and I both began to run up the hill to the nearby trees, but halfway up the road, the dart hit him and he fell down as well, now unconscious. We were dropping like flies, but I figured that these people who had almost gotten all of us by then were not outcasts. If they were the outcasts, then our blood would be running down the streets like a river, because they wouldn't hesitate to kill us. So who was this? I turned back and saw that all the people were now shooting me because everyone else was already unconscious. Suddenly, I felt a sharp needle hit the back of my shoulder. I quickly climbed the hill and went into the forest. Surprisingly, none of them followed me. My vision started to become blurry as I stumbled through the woods. The yellow leaves on the ground around me slowly became more clumped and blurrier as I stumbled past the many tall trees. I placed my hand on one and began to breathe even heavier. Suddenly, I saw someone walking from the woods, but I couldn't tell who it was because I was already blacking out. My hand slipped from the rough bark and I fell to the ground. My chest rose and fell to the ground very quickly as I tried to stay awake, but I just couldn't do it. I didn't have the strength to do it. I watched as a person came over to me and looked over me. Help, I tried to muster, and it seemed the person heard me. They reached down and flipped me over. They grabbed the dart on my shoulder and pulled it out. They flipped me over again, and I tried to see who my secret savior was, but it still wasn't working. They reached into their black jacket pocket and pulled out a syringe. They stabbed me in the arm and pressed it down. I was about to close my eyes, but suddenly I started to wake up. I looked into my savior's eyes and immediately regretted even bother being saved. His brown skin was slightly illuminated by the sun as he looked down on me. His messy black man bun was the same as I had remembered it, and I scowled. It was Rye. I rolled away from him immediately and stood up as I pulled out a gun and pointed it at him. He watched me and slowly raised his hands as he began to stand up in the crunchy leaves. Harley, right? He asked, still pretending to be a stranger. He smiled at me, but I had no more hesitation. I shot him in the chest, and he dropped his smile. He sighed as I emptied out all my rounds into his shirt. I was expecting him to be injured, but he had armor inside of his shirt based on the metal sounds I'd heard when the bullets made contact with him. I wanted to do this the easy way, but you guys really just don't want to listen, do you? Rai said as he got serious. Maybe if you didn't fight my corpse crawler, your friends wouldn't be locked up and beginning to go to the prison of survivors as we speak. I gasped as I realized what Rai's plan was. What? It really took you that long to figure it out? Part 34. The Valuable Cargo. You're not going anywhere, and you're not going to tell your guys out there to take my friends away. Got it? I demanded Rai angrily as I still raised my gun at his head, although I was out of ammo. Who's the one with the gun, though? He asked. I looked down at my gun, and he shook his head as he noticed his dumb mistake. Okay, I'll rephrase that. Who's the one with the power here? He asked again, but I quickly unloaded the gun and reloaded it. I shot right next to his head, and his eyes widened as he looked back at me. His head was the only vulnerable spot on his body. Me, I said, and his jaw dropped. You almost shot me, Rai yelled, and I smiled. Yeah, that was kind of the point of answering your questions. Isn't that what you wanted? I replied, and he smiled like he was still playing a sly little game with me. All right, then do it, I said as he closed his eyes and looked up. I dropped my finger off the side of the gun and prepared to fire like he said, but I knew that I couldn't do it. Although he was a monster, he was around the same age as me, and I couldn't just kill someone like him that easily. I gulped, but he unluckily seemed to notice this. He walked up to me slowly and grabbed the barrel of my gun and placed it on his forehead. What's the matter, Harley? Too scared to shoot your enemy down? He asked menacingly. My heart beat faster and faster as I went back and forth with the reasons to do it or not do it. He was giving me the chance to end all of this, and looking back on this after the moment passed, I really wished I had shot. Weakly, I lowered my gun. That's right, he said. Suddenly, he transformed into a giant red and black gooey monster with a large white streak across its eyes. It grew almost 3 times my size and looked down on me as my jaw dropped and my heart rate majorly increased. The monster reached forward with large claws on each hand and grabbed my gun. It snapped it in half and threw the remains inside. Suddenly, Rai transformed again into his regular self. I backed away from him as he yawned, like transforming into a vicious monster was usual, like a Monday for him. What was that? I yelled in fear as I continued to back away. I had seen his monster form before from the hologram, but not in person. It's the leader of the Chaos, or the Enigmas, but to make it look cool, it calls itself the Final Enigma. A good name, I guess, Rai said as he smiled. Suddenly, his arm rose like it was controlled by something else, and tried to punch Rai in the face. Rai grabbed his own arm and pushed it down, making the monster lose control, which it did, and gave up. Uh-huh, I said, still trying to comprehend all of this. How long has it been, well, inside of you? I asked. To be honest, it's been a couple of years for sure. I think it's been around 5 years since we met, and it entered my body, Rai replied. It looks like it kind of hates you, I said, and Rai smiled. It's a love-hate relationship, you could say. We're on the rocks right now, but surely there's no breakup in sight, he chuckled. Interesting, you love a monster, I said as I smiled, using this time to poke fun at Rai. Let's focus, shall we, Harley? All right, so as I was saying, Rai said, getting us both back on track. Right, so what are you planning to do to them? I asked. Well, I'm going to... Actually, I don't plan on telling you. You know, you're really lucky that I haven't ripped you to shreds right now. You know that, right? Rai asked. Yeah, but I'm still here, ain't I? I asked, and he smiled. Does Xavier know? Rai asked after a couple of moments. Know what? I asked, genuinely curious about what he meant. Cool, so he doesn't, Rai suggested. What are you talking about? I asked Rai. He probably thinks that you did actually leave the prison of the survivors on Sylvie's orders. Yet after all this time to bond and get to know each other, you still haven't explained the real truth? Wow, this is interesting, Rai said as he started to pace. I finally figured out what he meant as I circled the other way, trying to stay away from him. No, he doesn't know. And I don't plan on him obtaining that information either way if it's in your personal interest to know that, I said. That's an elaborate play, I can say, coming from a tactical perspective like mine, saying that my partner, Sylvie, ordered you to find the other survivors somewhere in Canada. It's risky, and I'm surprised he hasn't found out who you really are and why you're out here anyway, Rai said menacingly. I quickly glanced behind me, making sure no one else was listening. That was a while ago. Besides, everyone has their dark past, isn't that right, Rai? I asked Rai. I sent you out here. Yeah, that's right, I did, in case you forgot. You can go ahead and tell your fake story to Xavier 100,000 times, but sooner or later, he'll find out that I sent you out of the prison of the survivors to kill him, Rai said. finally exposing the truth for both of us. It was wrong and screwed up that you were tracking him and just waiting to kill him from the beginning. And you know that, I yelled in anger to defend Xavier. He knew something. He knew something. You were sent out to find him, learn about him. And while he turns away for one damn second, you shoot him in the skull. I knew that I should have gone, but it was Sylvie who persuaded me to focus on the travelers while you dealt with the others. The only thing that I didn't anticipate is all of them showing up so goddamn early. They're not even supposed to be here. They wouldn't even be on the road over here by now if you had obeyed and killed Xavier. But no, he won your stupid little hearts. It's all your soft little tender emotions toward each other that absolutely enrage me. The end of the world is coming soon, Harley, and you know it. We both do. If only you had dealt with the others, and all of this would have gone according to plan, Rai yelled at me. Your plan was trying to burn down the city. They are humans. They're trying to live. It's a common instinct. What, did you really think they would sit there and watch their world burn around them without actually fighting for it? That's the great thing about Eric. He won't stop fighting for what's right. He cares about us. All you do is send a bunch of people down to do the work that you should have done yourself, I yelled back. You want me to do it myself, then give up now and go back to the prison of the survivors right now. It's where you belong. In doing so, you'll finally drop all your little emotions and we can get back to business. You just stalled the apocalypse, but it's still coming like a bullet, and it's gonna hit all of them right in the bloody head. Oh, and I am going to enjoy that, Rai yelled. You're a monster, and we both know it. You're a sick, heartless, merciless leader, and you don't even deserve the privilege to be given control of the prison of the survivors. The only reason that Aaron Rodgers' dying wish to give you control of the Spark program, the prison of the survivors, and multi-labs is because he had no one else to turn to. You waited for it and didn't care when he died. Isn't that right? I yelled back again. You weren't there when he died. With his last dying breaths, he gave me everything. It seems hard to believe, Harley, but I refused it at first. He begged me to take it, but I continued to refuse. I didn't want that life. Finally, he turned to his other good friend, Xander. And for a short period of time, he ruled a terrible reign. He made terrible decisions for all of us, and everyone knew that he was terrible. Getting some fresh air into my system and a good place to think, I occasionally went to the top of the prison of the survivors. Since it was so high up, I could breathe regularly because the storm had not infected the atmosphere we were in. The air was a bit thin, but I survived. Every day, he made us lower down to the earth to gather materials that we never needed. One time, I saw something weird get on the ship. A couple days later, I saw it, a large red blob. I was curious about what it was, so I touched it. In doing so, it entered my body, and I began hearing the voice. Its voice. I also figured out that I could breathe the air that you all seem to suffer in regularly, thanks to the monster which gave itself the name, the final Enigma, like I just told you a few minutes ago. It told me to kill Xander, so I obeyed. I brought him up to where I had gone to get away from the city, and I transformed into a monster for the very first time and bit his head clean off and threw the remains to the shit show below. I didn't mean to do it. But now that I think about it, I gained so much power from doing so, and it feels good. Aaron's order for the next in line after Xander was me, just in case I wanted to come back. This time, I fully embraced the power inside of me, and for the next 5 years, I controlled everything, and it was perfect. My paradise of the prison of the survivors. Then, I start seeing many insurgency attacks around my city. I began to wonder where they came from, but then I began to wonder where they were coming from, if they were coming from my city. But then, around a week ago, I captured a very important person to their cause, and I learned all about them. Oh, and speaking of, Rai said as he turned around, out of the woods came 3 men. 2 wore bandanas and seemed to work for Rai, but the third one was in a dusty black jacket and bruised up. They had a large bag over their face, preventing them from looking around. The 2 others in the bandanas made them get on their knees, and they obeyed. They walked back into the woods, and Rai pulled off the bag. There was a young Indian-looking man who was the same age as me and looked like Rai. He looked at me, his eyes still adjusting to the light. Oh, if only Eric was there. Part 35. Amid the Night. There's no way I said in disbelief as the sun started to set and the night began to rise once more. Based on what Eric had constantly told all of us what the one and only hope for taking down Rye looked like, this man met every single checkmark. Agent 39. In the flesh, Rye said evilly. Why would you bring him down here of all places? I asked. Why not? A little intimidation never hurt anyone, did it? Rye chuckled. Suddenly, I heard honking coming from the street below me near the visitor center. Ah, that must be your friends. So, you can either stay here and learn everything that you want to know about me or the entire prison of the survivors or literally anything, and I will answer. Or, you can go down there and try to save those losers who won't believe there's no way to win against me. So, Harley, what do you want to do? Rye proposed. Agent 39 began to choke on the air, so Rye helped him by sliding up his bandana. He rolled his eyes. He didn't bother to acknowledge it, but it was just a silent thanks. I focused once more on his proposal, but I was split. I needed answers to some of the burning questions I had for Rye, but I knew that the power of love was better than that. I'll take my chances with them, I said, as the sun set even more and the sky got even darker. Are you sure? Rye asked, and I paused for a moment. He couldn't believe it. Finally, I spoke my heart. I'm fighting for what I want. You may not be, but this is what I want, Rye, I said as I turned and began to walk away. Suddenly, I heard Agent 39 call out to me. Wait, I'm sorry, I don't know your name, but Agent 39 said. Harley, I said. Harley, if you see Eric, tell him that it was worth it, Agent 39 said. What was it? I asked. Everything that we did together. It didn't seem like much, but it definitely sparked so much more than we could have thought, Agent 39 explained. I thought you were just doing it for the greater good, I tried to clarify. You're right. At the moment it was fun. We were simply doing the right thing. But now that I've been trapped for what feels like so long, not knowing what's happening outside of a small little room I call my home, I realized a small but simple thing. Maybe you've noticed it before, but it may have just seemed like we were having fun at the moment, but we were making memories. Memories of a dream to break free. It may not have seemed like much, but it was just a little step we needed to get to where we were. We know more now, but the one thing that it cost me was coming to the prison of the survivors as a hostage for so long. I don't know if I will ever be saved, but I just need you to tell Eric that all that we did wasn't for nothing. Although it seems so small and useless, all right? Agent 39 asked me. I nodded sincerely, and I saw tears begin to form in his eyes. He looked around and sighed. God, what a beautiful world it is out here, Agent 39 said with a shaky voice. I hadn't known him that much, but just hearing him say something that simple that everyone else saw every day made my heart shatter. I tried not to cry, feeling terrible about him. I heard the engine start behind me, and I knew that I had to get going, although the souls in my body urged me to stay and listen to them both. I turned once more, but I remembered that I had one more thing to check on. I know that you don't like to talk about this, but how is it going? I asked Rye. What? Rye asked. You know, your sickness that you told me about a while ago, I asked. I knew that he didn't want to talk about it, but I had to ask. To be honest, it's not getting better. The only thing that's preventing it right now is this monster inside of me. Thanks for asking, I guess, Rye said, showing his weak side. I remember when Rye had brought me into a meeting with him, someone named Jamal and Sylvie was there too. He had brought me in because he trusted me, and I trusted him as well. He told us the news and told us to keep it a secret. So we did. I knew that Rye wouldn't live forever, but although I wished him dead, I was happy that I didn't pull the trigger when he asked me to. I nodded and ran back down to the hill to the road. As I ran, I thought that it was nice to drop our hate for what side we both were on and really talk like humans for just a second. I smiled as I jumped down the road away from Rye and Agent 39 and began running down the hill to the large black trucks down below. There was now barely any light left in the sky as I ran down the hill. I ran against the rocks, and I saw the men around the truck finally get in. When they all got inside the trucks, I ran around from the rocky edge and jumped onto the side of the van. I reached into my pocket and felt my gun still loaded. I looked at the trees where I had come from, and although I couldn't see them, they were still there. Now, I finally realized that Rai wasn't actually purely corrupt and evil, but it was the monster's intentions to use him that poisoned him. If only there was a way to get the monster off of Rai, then no more blood would have to be spilled. I nodded to myself in confidence, now knowing what our new mission was: to save Rai and kill the final Enigma. The only problem was trying to get my new realization to the others before a full-fledged war actually started and blood ran down the sides of the earth like paint. The only problem with getting rid of the final Enigma from Rai was that he would regain the full force of the sickness that he had. I sighed, as this would be harder than I had thought, than any of us had thought. I turned back toward the back of the black door I was hanging off of as the trucks began to drive down the hill. My hands began to sweat, and my knuckles were white from holding onto the back of the door on top of the rocky roads as we exited the city. As we passed by the outskirts of downtown Colorado Springs, where we previously were stationed before the Outcasts had kicked us out, I couldn't see any of the other Outcasts. They were either discussing their plan to kill us, in the mountains still trying to find us, or hiding from the two mysterious black fans that had just suddenly appeared outside of their town. We finally drove past it and entered the large desert as the darkness of night finally set in. The stars began to come out. I peeked around the side of the back of the truck and saw the massive prison of the survivors in the middle of the desert. Its large limbs and rings, like I like to call them, held up the large area above it. It was intended to fly up and down. Its engines were on, and it seemed to be ready to leave any moment. Suddenly, I saw a small ship fly above us and enter the top of the prison. It was definitely Rai with Agent 39. I knew that I had to stop the truck, but I wasn't sure how. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my gun. I moved it closer to my body in the truck to prevent myself from dropping it and losing all hope of breaking them out. I banged the barrel of the gun on the door, and judging on the sudden increase in the amount of conversation inside, I could tell that they heard me. Suddenly, the door of the truck opened, and I held on tight as I was flung with the door farther and farther away from the truck. The man inside yelled at the others inside that there was nothing, but I realized that it was the perfect time to strike when they were confused. I pushed my arms up and quickly jumped down just as the man closed the door. He cursed loudly as I punched him square in the face. He suddenly began to stumble around, so I quickly reopened the door and pushed him out onto the desert floor. "Hold on tight!" I yelled as I pointed the gun past everybody's head and shot where the driver was. I heard yelling from the passenger seat, so I moved my gun over and shot there too. Finally, it was silent. The truck began to turn quickly, and when I looked out the back of the open truck, I saw that we were now heading away from the prison of the survivors. A large turret suddenly rose from above the large open bay door where we were supposed to enter through and began to fire at us with large blue blasts of energy. Luckily, we seemed to dodge all of them. Finally, the turret struck the ground in front of the truck, and we were all launched into the air like it was a ramp. "Jump!" I yelled, and they all immediately stood up and dived out of the truck. We all fell to the ground as the truck landed with some pieces flying out of it, heading toward the city. I gulped, for it would probably alert the outcast about where we were if they still were in the town and hadn't gone to the mountains, and if they hadn't seen us yet. I saw the other truck driving away toward the prison with all of the other travelers, which I didn't really know, and began to run toward it. Everyone else got up and followed me, but we all stopped when we realized that we were too late. The bay doors quickly closed, and I realized that the only travelers left were Xavier, Patient One, Samantha, Deshawn, Eric, and me. I suddenly dived out of the way of the incoming turret projectile. Everyone else did the same as it hit the ground and would have incinerated us if we had stood there. We all stood up and stood together. I turned to Eric and told him what happened. "Agent 39 says that all that you both did was for something," I said simply to Eric. His jaw dropped and he cursed in shock. "Are you serious?" he said with confusion and excitement. "I met him and Rai in the woods while you all were kidnapped," I said. "Jesus Christ, this changes everything now that we know," Eric yelled with excitement. "How so?" Patient One asked. "Now that we know that Agent 39's alive, we can try and get him back, and we can finally defeat Rai." "Don't you get what this means?" Eric yelled excitedly. We all moved out of the way as another blast from the turret shot where we were. "Holy shit, he's right," Samantha said, piecing it together. Finally, all of us agreed that we had a new goal. "Now, we need to get on that ship and get him, right?" Deshawn asked, as we all looked up at the ship as it slowly rose into the air. It began to rise faster and faster, as we all stared in utter disappointment. "Maybe when it comes back down, we can get back on," Patient One said, trying to lighten the mood. We all stood in silence and disbelief, realizing that we were so close to starting the revolution, but yet so far away from it. We turned toward the city and saw around 4 trucks speeding toward us. The outcasts were there and didn't go up to the mountains after all. The moon shone down on the sandy desert as they sped across. I noticed that no one had a gun or, in fact, nothing at all except me. I knew that we had no way out of this. We gotta turn ourselves in, I guess, Samantha said, reading all of our minds. Yup, Eric said, as they got closer and closer. He turned to all of us, and we all huddled together. All right, listen. I really don't like permanence in anything, but I prefer things to change, but this will have to do, Eric said, quickly as the trucks were now seconds away from arriving. What will have to do? I asked him. This group. For now. I know that we may not like each other or even remember each other's names, in fact, but we have to work together to get the rest of the travelers up there, back down here, and away from Rye. So, we push forward with our plan at full force. Once we get Agent 39, we can go out around the world to New York, Mexico, Las Vegas, Los Angeles, and finally here to take out the other prisons and Rye, Eric said. There are other prisons? Patient 1 asked, asking the immediate question we had after hearing what he had said. Yeah, they each have different names, and which I can't remember at the moment, but those have weak security measures, and we can easily take them down, then look at this one, and then take the whole thing down once and for all. That is if we can get there. Maybe just this one. I'm not sure for now. It's a long plan, but after all of it, we will be free, Eric explained, outlining his plan to us. I knew that fate didn't have nice endings for all of us, but we had to try. We dispersed as the trucks arrived. Freeze! All of them yelled as they jumped out of the truck and ran toward us. They kicked us all to the ground, and we all got handcuffs put on us. Surprisingly, they didn't murder us right there. Yeah, now you've just started a war, guys, in case you're wondering, one of them said as they picked us up and threw us in the trucks. Listen, we have, Eric started, but he was interrupted. Save it for Sam, bud, another one said. We drove back to the city as the prison of the survivors entered the upper atmosphere and stopped in midair. Finally, we reached the city, and they took us out vigorously without any remorse. They shoved us down the streets, and we eventually reached the work-in-progress traveler's joint. They pushed us inside and immediately sat us in chairs. We were now handcuffed in the face of the enemy. Sam came in from the other room and walked toward us. Ah, the travelers. Your numbers have dwindled majorly, I can see, Sam said evilly. We all scowled at him. Yeah, we know. Listen, we have major news and it may help us take down Rye. Yeah, the big man who controls the multiverse. Him, Eric explained. You really think I care about a young man who rules the multiverse? I haven't even seen him, Sam yelled, immediately drowning out our idea. You're gonna give us what we want, or we're gonna rip you apart, Sam said as he bent down to us. Let's start with splitting the group, shall we? Sam said as the men walked forward. That one, and that one can all go into another building, and the others can stay here, Sam said as he pointed to Deshaun, Eric, and Xavier. Patient 1, Samantha, and I gasped. You won't lay a single finger on Deshaun, you mother... Samantha immediately yelled at Sam as they began to drag him out. Get away from them! Xavier! I yelled as Xavier was dragged outside. Finally, they were all dragged outside, and we were left screaming at nothing. Now that that's settled, let's talk about what you did, shall we? Sam said as he grabbed a crowbar from the pool table. He gulped as he smiled with his greedy eyes at everything he wanted. This episode was recorded by Tristan Kumar. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure to check out Act 8, The City of Peril. That's going to be a pretty good one. And yeah, this is the making good progress on Volume 2. But if you enjoyed this, check that out. You guys are amazing. Thank you so much. See you next time. Bye.